The cup didn't rattle when she set it down. That was the detail nobody in the chamber would forget. Not the ship, not the silence. The cup, chipped white ceramic, standing steady on polished stone while 4,000 species held their breath. Captain Solène Voss stood alone on the council floor, gray threading the edges of her dark hair, a dog tag from a woman she'd never met resting cold against her collarbone. Above her, 80 meters of pale stone curved into crystal light panels that had burned without flicker for 9,000 years. The air smelled of ozone and old paper, the smell of an institution that had never once been surprised. Until now. 12 orbital platforms held their position. 600 interceptor drones waited on standby, weapons hot, targeting locks fed by a defense grid that had never failed to fire on an unregistered vessel. It did not fire now. Nobody had told it to hold. Nobody had told it anything. It simply watched the ship behind Voss, 2.3 kilometers of blackened hull, no transponder, no registry, and did nothing, because 9,000 years of galactic law had no article for a ship that showed up and made no threats at all. Archon Drueth Vorkai stood at the central platform, his ceremonial plate catching the light, 47 battle markings scored into the metal. His left optical implant flickered once. He did not speak. For the first time in 3,400 years of Vorkai rule, the chair of the Galactic Council had nothing to say. Voss looked at the cup. Then she looked up, past the Archon, past the frozen chamber, toward the gallery where an old Vrethkai sat with his hand trembling on the rail. I wish I could tell you what she said next. I can't, not yet. Stay with me. This part matters more than you think. The alarm tone was 8,000 years old. Nobody alive knew what it meant. 6 hours before Solène Voss ever set foot on that floor, Vex Koreth was doing what he had done for 2 centuries, recording a vote nobody would remember by morning. He sat in the observer's gallery, a bronze ring on his smallest finger from a world he could no longer name, his left hand steady on the rail. 247 years old, retired war chronicler of the Vrethkai Conquest Bureau, a man who had documented 6 campaigns and told himself he had finished being surprised. The council was voting on tariff language, nothing sharper than that. Representatives murmured in 40 dialects, translation columns humming behind each seat. Vex logged the motion, logged the count, and reached for his stylus to log the result. Then the tone came. It didn't sound like an alarm. It sounded like a bell struck once in an empty room, low enough to feel in the teeth. Every crystal panel in the chamber dimmed half a shade. The translation hum stuttered and caught itself. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Vex's left hand began to shake. He hadn't felt that tremor in decades. Not since the last campaign. He set the stylus down and gripped his own wrist, willing it still, and it would not still, and some old soldier's instinct beneath the chronicler's calm told him, "You have heard this before, and you were afraid then too." Below, Archon Drueth rose from the central platform. "Identify the source," he said, voice like gravel settling under a boot. Nobody answered him. Nobody could. The frequency wasn't in any registry. It wasn't in any archive. It predated the archive. Beside Vex, a Sarvari elder named Ilan sat with her long hands folded, her photographic memory species famous across the chamber for saying nothing at all. She had not spoken in 300 years, not once, not in any recorded session. Her elder's silence was a kind of protest nobody had ever understood. She spoke now. "It has come back," Ilan said. Her voice cracked on the last word, dry as a page nobody had turned in a very long time. Every head in the gallery turned toward her. She did not elaborate. She folded her hands tighter and watched the main viewport, where space itself began to fold and darken at the chamber's edge. Vex leaned forward. His tremor hadn't stopped. He would think about that later, the fact that his body knew before his mind did. The ship didn't so much arrive as refuse to have been anywhere else. There was no hyperspace flare, no drive signature, no warning beacon. One moment the viewport showed clean stars. The next it showed a hull, and the hull was wrong in a way that took the eye a full second to understand. Not wrong like damaged. Wrong like old in a way starships weren't supposed to get, because starships that old didn't survive. 2.3 kilometers of blackened plating, radiation scarred to the color of a bruise gone deep. No running lights. No transponder ping. No registry beacon of any kind, which by itself should have triggered 40 automated defense protocols. None of them triggered. The Council's 12 orbital platforms simply logged the object and waited, as if some older subroutine, buried deeper than policy, had recognized the shape and told the guns to stand down. The shape was the second wrong thing, too angular. Too heavy at the prow, tapering wrong toward the stern. Built by hands that had never once consulted a modern hull registry, because there had been no modern hull registry when this ship was laid down. Defense grid, Dreweth barked, full alert, weapons hot. The grid armed. 600 drones swung their targeting locks onto the newcomer. The newcomer did not respond. It did not accelerate, did not arm, did not broadcast so much as a single burst of static. It simply drifted closer, patient as a tide, and let itself be seen. Vex Korath stood, which he almost never did during session. His tremor had climbed from his hand into his forearm. He gripped the rail and made himself watch, because 2 centuries of chronicling had taught him one rule above all others. When your own body is afraid, that is the moment to look closer, not away. Below him, a small voice cut through the murmur. Tess, the Volley Bridge liaison, barely into her 4th decade, the smallest delegate in the chamber and usually the quietest, stood at her station and said the thing nobody else would. What is it waiting for? Nobody answered her. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer, and it was the wrong kind, the kind that told Vex this was going to be a longer session than tariff language. I'll be honest. What I saw in the next hour rewired 2 centuries of certainty. But you need the shape of it first, the way I got it piece by piece, redaction by redaction, until the whole thing stood up and had a name. The magnification resolved further. Along the ship's forward hull, beneath 8,000 years of radiation scarring, something had been painted. Not registry code, not a fleet marking. Letters, human letters, weathered but legible, pigment that had somehow outlasted vacuum and starlight in every century since. We are not lost. Dreweth's optical implant flickered hard enough that the whole chamber saw it. Lost from what? He said, to no one, to everyone. There is no vessel of this class in any registry. There is no class of this class. Vex already knew, though he could not have said how. The tremor in his hand had answered before his mind caught up, the way old soldiers sometimes know a shape in the dark before they can name it. He turned to the archive terminal built into the gallery rail. Still standing, still shaking, he keyed a search on the frequency. The tone. The 8,000-year-old bell nobody alive should have recognized. 12 results returned. Then, one by one, as he watched, 11 of them collapsed into redacted black bars, the timestamps on the redactions all reading the same age, 72 hours after each original filing. Someone had been erasing this ship from the record, again and again, for longer than most species in the chamber had existed. One entry survived. A single line, unredacted, buried in a maintenance log nobody had thought worth scrubbing. The Shepherd had no weapons registry. The Shepherd had no crew manifest. The Shepherd had a mission. Vex read it twice. His hand would not stop shaking now, not even when he pressed it flat against the cold rail. Below the ship, the Shepherd, he understood now, though nobody had said the name aloud yet, continued its slow drift toward the station, unarmed, unhurried, 8,000 years late for an appointment nobody in the chamber remembered making. Ilyn, beside him, finally lifted her head. 300 years of silence, and she was the only one in the gallery who didn't look surprised. "Now you'll understand," she said quietly, "why I stopped talking." The tremor had reached his shoulder now. Vex had chronicled 6 campaigns and never once needed to sit down mid-session. He sat down. "Explain," Drueth said, and this time the word cracked toward Ilan like an accusation. "You said now you'll understand. Understand what?" Ilan did not turn from the viewport. "You will not like the answer, Archon. You never do." "I did not ask for your comfort. I asked for a briefing." "There is no briefing." Her voice, unused for 3 centuries, had the texture of dust settling. "There is only a story the Council chose to forget, because remembering it meant admitting a species smaller than yours had done something larger than anything in your archive." Drueth's optical implant stuttered again, longer this time. Around the chamber, 4,000 delegates leaned forward as one, the translation columns catching a rare moment where every species wanted the same word at the same time. "The humans," Ilan said, "made a promise, before they ever sat in this chamber, before the Council knew their name." "Humans have held a seat for 300 years, Drueth said. 300 years of votes, tariffs, border disputes. Nothing in their file suggests promises. Nothing in their file suggests this." He gestured at the viewport, where the Shepherd continued its unhurried drift, hull markings catching starlight like old scar tissue. "Their file," Ilan said, "is the epilogue, not the story." On the Shepherd's bridge, 6 hours felt like 6 minutes. Captain Solène Voss stood at the forward console, gray threading her dark hair at the temples, and did not look at the tactical display showing 600 drones arming around her ship. She had grown up watching that kind of number and feeling nothing. Her mother had taught her that. Her mother's mother had taught her mother. She sipped cold tea from a chipped ceramic cup and said nothing. Behind her, the bridge held 4 crew, all born aboard, all trained from childhood in a mission none of them had chosen and none of them had ever questioned enough to leave. Lieutenant Amara Kess, 3rd generation, monitored the drone lock count without alarm in her voice. "Full arm, all 12 platforms. They think we're a threat. They think that because threat is the only shape they've been taught to see." Voss set the cup down on the console, careful, the way she'd set it down 10,000 times before. The crack in the glaze had come from a docking maneuver 6 generations back. Nobody aboard remembered which captain had chipped it, only that the cup had survived, and that survival itself had become a kind of doctrine. 12 journals, Kess said, glancing at the shelf behind the captain's chair, handwritten logs going back 8,000 years, spines cracked and rebound and cracked again. "Do we open the last one?" "Not yet." Voss watched the station grow larger in the viewport, pale stone and crystal light, an institution that had outlived every empire that built it. "The mission doesn't end until we're inside their walls. That's always been the rule." "Whose rule?" Voss almost smiled. It was the question every generation aboard the Shepherd eventually asked, and the answer never changed. "The one we made before any of us were born." Back in the gallery, Vex had pulled up every scrap the archive terminal would surrender, which by now was almost nothing. The redactions formed a pattern, once he stopped looking at each one alone and started looking at the shape between them. 12 filings, 11 silenced within 72 hours, always by the same authorization code, a code that traced, when he dug past 3 firewalls he technically wasn't cleared for, to the Vorkai Dominion's oldest standing order. Not a person, an institution. Someone, some office, some inherited policy older than Drueth himself, had made it their business for 8,000 years to erase this ship every time it surfaced in the record. Why erase a ghost story, Vex thought, unless the ghost was real and the truth was worse than the myth? He found the 12th filing last, buried under a maintenance classification nobody had thought to scrub because nobody had thought it mattered. A single sentence, dated centuries before humanity ever held a council seat. Vessel designation Shepherd, human crewed, confirmed present at the Kelrath incursion. No hostile action taken. No demand issued. Departed without contact. Vex read it 3 times. The Kelrath incursion. He knew that name, every Vrethkai chronicler knew that name, the way every soldier knows the battle that should have ended their species and somehow didn't. 6,000 years ago, a Xenocide fleet had turned back from Vrethkai space for reasons the histories had never explained. His own people had built 3 centuries of myth around an unexplained retreat. His hand, already shaking, went still for the first time since the alarm sounded. Stillness, he realized, was worse than the tremor. Stillness meant his body had finally caught up to what his mind was refusing to say out loud. "Archon," he said, and his own voice surprised him with how far it carried. "I have something you need to hear." Drueth turned, irritation already forming. "Chronicler, this is not your session to address." "It is now." Vex stood and the tremor returned, worse, traveling down into his fingers as he held up the terminal. The Shepherd was present at the Kelrath incursion, 6,000 years ago. It took no hostile action. It issued no demand. It simply was there, and a fleet that should have ended my species turned around and left. The chamber's murmur died into something closer to silence than it had held all session. "That is not possible," Drueth said, but the flicker in his optical implant said otherwise. "The Kelrath retreat has 11 competing explanations in the historical record. None of them mention a human vessel." "None of them," Vex said, "because someone redacted it, the same authorization code, the same 72-hour window." He set the terminal down, hands shaking so hard now the device rattled against the rail. "Archon, how many times has this ship saved a species in this chamber? And how many times has your dominion made sure nobody remembered?" Tess, small and rarely heard, rose from her station on the floor below. Her voice carried further than her size suggested it should. "If it saved us before," she said, "then why is the grid still armed?" Nobody answered. Drueth's jaw tightened, the ceremonial plate at his collar catching light off 47 battle markings he'd earned believing that strength was the only currency that mattered. "Because," he said finally, "a ship that arrives without demanding anything is more dangerous than one that does. A ship you cannot threaten is a ship you cannot control. And a ship you cannot control," his voice dropped, gravel settling harder than before, "does not belong in a council built on control." Ilyn, still seated, still folded-handed, spoke without turning her head. "Now you understand why I stopped talking 300 years ago, Archon. I said one true thing in a room built to punish true things. I decided silence was safer. And now the silence is over." For the first time since Vex had known her decades, a lifetime of shared sessions, Ilyn stood. "Because it's back, and this time it isn't leaving quietly." The Shepherd's hull filled half the viewport now, close enough that the painted words beneath the radiation scarring had multiplied. Not one line, dozens. A ledger written across 8,000 years of hull plating, in a language the chamber was only now learning to read. Vex's tremor climbed all the way to his elbow. Whatever came next, he understood, was not going to fit in a maintenance log anyone could redact. "Fire," Drueth said. The word cracked through the chamber like a physical thing. 600 drones already locked, needed only the order, and for one terrible second the order stood. Then nothing happened. Not hesitation. Refusal. The defense grid's central relay, older than Drueth's own command authority, held station and would not transmit the command. A junior Vorkai officer at the weapons console stared at his readout, face draining pale beneath his plate helm. "Archon," he said, "the grid won't take the order." "Override it." "There is no override, sir. The protocol predates the Dominion's command architecture. He swallowed. Its original construction, 9,000 years old. Whoever built this station wrote a rule into its bones that a ship flying no weapon and issuing no demand cannot be fired upon, not by policy, by design. Vex felt the tremor climb into his jaw. Someone, 9,000 years ago, had built a law deeper than any vote the Council would ever hold, and buried it where 3 millennia of Vorkai control had never thought to look, because they had never imagined needing to look. Then this council, Ilan said quietly, was built to protect exactly what it just tried to destroy. The shepherd docked without requesting clearance, because none had ever been denied. Solen Voss walked the boarding corridor alone. Behind her, Kess held the bridge. Ahead, station security lined the approach in full riot plate, weapons raised, none of them certain what they were pointing at. Voss carried nothing. No sidearm, no shield, no delegation credentials. Only the cup held loose in one hand, tea gone cold an hour ago. A security captain stepped into her path. Identify yourself, state your registry. Solen Voss, she stopped unhurried, 8th generation crew of the Shepherd. That vessel has no registry. No, she agreed. It has a mission. She looked past him, toward the chamber doors, toward 4,000 species waiting on the other side of stone 80 meters tall. I'd like to finish it now, if the council doesn't mind. The captain didn't lower his weapon. He also didn't fire it. Something in her voice, the same patience her mother had carried, and her mother's mother before that, made the barrel feel foolish in his hands. He stepped aside before he understood why. Vex met her at the chamber threshold. He hadn't planned to. His legs had simply carried him there, tremor and all, 2 centuries of chronicling insisting he stand close enough to write down whatever came next with his own eyes instead of second-hand. Voss looked at him, really looked, the way people rarely bothered to look at an old soldier turned scribe, and something in her expression softened. "You're the one whose hand won't stop shaking," she said. "You knew that before you walked in. The Shepherd's sensors are older than your council's weapons grid. They notice things." She held up the cup slightly, an old habit rather than an offering. "It only shakes around ships like mine, something in the frequency. Bodies remember what archives erase." Vex stared at his own hand as if seeing it for the first time. The alarm tone, the tremor started the moment it sounded. "Because your species heard that tone before," Voss said, "long before you were a chronicler. Long before the Vrethkai kept records at all." She didn't explain further. She walked past him into the chamber, and he found himself falling into step beside her, notebook forgotten, hands still shaking, mind already reaching for a truth he wasn't sure his craft had words for. Inside, the chamber had gone the particular kind of silent that comes before a verdict. Voss crossed the floor alone, footsteps unhurried on polished stone, 4,000 delegates watching a woman who carried no weapon, no credential, nothing but a chipped cup, and a patience that made Drueth's ceremonial plate look like theater. She stopped at the center platform. She did not look up at the Archon. She looked instead at the cup in her hand, turned it once, and set it down on the stone before her. It did not rattle. That was the detail the chamber would carry for the rest of its existence. Not the ship outside, not the frozen drones, not even the tremor that had by now spread through half the Vrethkai delegation in sympathetic recognition. None of them could explain. Just a cup, standing steady, its crack catching the light. "Explain yourself," Drueth said. His voice had lost some of its gravel. "State your business before this council." "I don't have business," Voss said. "I have an answer to a question your Dominion has spent 8,000 years trying to make sure nobody asked." "What question?" Voss finally looked up. Why did the Shepherd leave 6,000 years ago without a word after the Kelrath fleet turned back? Your chronicler already found that record. "He's standing right behind me." Every eye in the chamber shifted to Vex. His hand shook so hard he had to grip his own wrist to steady it. "Tell them," Voss said, not unkindly. You've earned the honor of saying it first." Vex's voice, when it came, barely carried past the first row. The shepherd was there. It took no hostile action. It issued no demand. The fleet retreated anyway. "Because presence," Voss said, turning back to the chamber, "was the demand. A ship that has kept watch for 8,000 years does not need to threaten anyone. It only needs to be there and let the ones who remember what it did the last time draw their own conclusions." Drueth's optical implant flickered again. "You are describing a bluff. An empty vessel trading on reputation." "I'm describing a promise." Voss's voice hardened just slightly, the first edge Vex had heard from her. "My family made it before your council existed, before the word Vorkai meant anything beyond a settlement on a cold moon. We said we would watch. We never said we would explain ourselves while we did it." That was when the mid-collapse came, though nobody in the chamber recognized it as anything but Ilan finally finishing what she'd started. The Sarvari elder rose from her seat in the gallery, 300 years of silence behind her, and her voice, dry, cracked, unused to carrying this far, reached every translation column in the chamber without needing amplification. "There is a 13th filing," she said. Every head turned. Vex's stomach dropped. He'd found 12, 11 redacted, 1 surviving. Ilan was telling him and everyone else that his count had been wrong from the start. "The Vorkai redacted 12, Ilan said. "They never found the 13th because it wasn't filed under the shepherd's designation. It was filed under mine. My testimony. 300 years ago, at the Sarvari accession hearing, I watched this ship arrive above my homeworld and turn back an invasion fleet twice the size of anything your dominion has fielded since. I wrote it down. I sealed it under my own name, where your redaction code could never reach it, because your code only erases what it recognizes as a threat to itself." The chamber held its breath. "I have said nothing for 3 centuries, Ilan went on, because I was waiting to see if the shepherd would need a witness again. It does now, and I am done being silent about what I owe it." Drueth's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the session began, something like fear crossed the old warrior's face. Not of the ship, not of the drones, but of a chamber that was starting, sentence by sentence, to remember everything his dominion had spent 3,400 years making sure it forgot. "This changes nothing," he said, but even the translation columns seemed to carry less conviction in the words than in anyone else's that day. "It changes everything," Voss said quietly, and did not raise her voice to say it. "It just took you 3,000 years to notice." Ilan's testimony hung in the chamber like smoke that wouldn't clear. Drueth opened his mouth to answer and found, for the first time in 3,400 years of Vorkai rule, that no answer existed in any file he could reach. Voss let the silence sit. She had learned that from her mother, who had learned it from hers. The council always mistook silence for weakness, right up until it wasn't. "There is no vote for this," Drueth finally said. "No article, no precedent." "There doesn't need to be." Vex's voice again, steadier now, the tremor in his hand having reached some strange plateau where it simply hummed instead of shook. "I checked the station's original construction charter while Ilan spoke, 9,000 years old. Written before the Dominion held a single seat." He held up the terminal, hand vibrating faintly against the light. "It says the council exists to remember what species owe each other, not to vote on it, to remember it." That is a chronicler's reading of an engineering document. "It's the only reading that explains why your grid wouldn't fire," Vex said. "The station itself was built to protect this exact moment. Somebody, 9,000 years ago, already knew a day would come when an institution forgot what it was for and left a door nobody could vote shut." Voss crouched, unhurried, and lifted the cup from the stone floor. She didn't drink from it. She simply held it, turning the chip in the glaze toward the light so the whole chamber could see the hairline crack that had survived 6 generations of docking, war, and silence. My great-great-grandmother chipped this the day the shepherd left Kelrath space, she said. She wrote about it in the ship's log, not the retreat, not the fleet, just the cup. She said it felt wrong to replace something that had lasted, even broken. We've been drinking cold tea out of it ever since. Nobody ever thought to explain why. It was just what the shepherd did. Vex felt something settle behind his sternum, the tremor easing for the first time all day. He looked down at his own hand, at the bronze ring on his smallest finger, a ring he'd worn for decades and never once been able to place, inherited from a grandfather who died before Vex was old enough to ask where it came from. He turned it slowly. Etched inside the band, worn nearly smooth, were 3 characters in a script he hadn't recognized in 60 years of trying. He recognized it now. It matched the hull markings outside the viewport, letter for letter. His grandfather had served in the Kelrath system. His grandfather had never once spoken of what happened there. Vex did not say this aloud. He didn't need to. Voss glanced at his hand, at the ring catching the light, and something like recognition passed between them. Quiet, unspoken, the kind of understanding that didn't require a chamber full of witnesses. Bodies remember what archives erase, she'd told him. He understood now that she hadn't only meant the tremor. Archon Drueth. A new voice from the floor this time, Tess, small and precise, stepping forward from her station with the particular fearlessness only the very young or the very sure ever managed in this chamber. The grid won't fire. The chronicler found a buried filing your own code missed. A 300-year-old elder just broke a silence she'd sworn to keep. And you're still asking for a vote. Someone must hold this chamber together, Drueth said, and for the first time his gravel voice cracked, not with anger but with something closer to grief. If presence is enough, if a ship with no weapons and no explanation can simply stand here and unmake 3,000 years of order, then what was any of it for? The votes, the doctrine, the grid. Voss set the cup back down, gently, and looked at him with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so free of malice. It was never about unmaking your order, Archon. Nobody asked you to disarm the grid. The grid disarmed itself, because the law you built your whole authority on top of was never as deep as the one underneath it. Drueth said nothing. His optical implant flickered once more, then held steady, the tremor of light settling the way old machinery settles when it finally stops fighting its own wiring. He turned from the platform. He did not announce a resignation. He did not call for a vote on his own standing. He simply walked, plate armor scraping softly against stone, past 47 battle markings that had never once prepared him for a war fought with silence and a chipped cup. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. A council built on filing and voting had no mechanism for a man whose relevance had simply, quietly ended. He did not look back. The doors closed behind him without ceremony, and somehow that was worse than any exile a vote could have delivered. 60 seconds of stillness followed. Then the chamber, 4,000 species strong, did something it had not done in living memory. It waited for someone else to speak first, and nobody hurried to fill the silence. Voss broke it herself, quiet, unbothered by the weight of the room. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said. "I never was. The mission was only ever to watch and to be seen watching when it mattered enough to matter. It mattered today." "And now," Tess asked from the floor, "what happens now?" Voss picked the cup back up, held it loosely, the same unhurried grip she'd carried through the boarding corridor. Now the shepherd goes back to doing what it's done for 8,000 years. It watches. It doesn't explain itself while it does. She glanced toward Vex one last time, something almost gentle in it. Some of what it watches gets written down, eventually, by someone whose hand won't stop shaking until they do. Vex Korath wrote the official account that night, alone in the observer's gallery, the chamber empty around him for the first time in 2 centuries of sessions. His hand had not fully stopped trembling. He had stopped trying to make it. He wrote the vote that never happened. He wrote the grid that refused an order older than any Dominion command. He wrote Ilan's 13th filing, sealed under her own name for 300 years, and the moment she'd broken a silence longer than most species recorded history. He wrote Druath's back, the sound of the door, the absence where 3,000 years of authority had simply stopped mattering. He did not write about the ring. Some things, he decided, a chronicler kept for himself. Outside the station, unseen by the sensors that had once armed 600 drones against it, the Shepherd began its slow turn away from the platform hull markings, catching the last of the crystal light before the dark swallowed them again. No fanfare, no formal departure. It simply left the way it had arrived, without asking permission, without needing any. On its bridge, Solène Voss set the chipped cup down on the console one final time. The crack did not matter. It had held for 8,000 years. It would hold for what came next. Behind her, Kes glanced at the 12th journal, still unopened, still waiting on its shelf. "Do we write today down?" "We always do." Voss watched the station shrink behind them, pale stone and crystal light folding back into starlight and distance. "That's the mission, not the watching, the remembering." The ship turned dark side out, engine silent, and was gone. In the gallery, long after the chamber had emptied, Vex Korath set down his stylus. His hand, at last, had gone still. He looked once more at the bronze ring on his smallest finger, turned it so the worn letters caught the light, and did not need to write down what it meant. Some readers would understand without being told. He closed the account with the only line the story had ever needed. It remembered.